I laughed the morning I found out. Not a bitter laugh, not a broken one, just this quiet, exhausted sound that came out of me while I stood in my kitchen in Sudbury, Ontario, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold. My nephew had just called to congratulate himself. He actually said those words. "Auntie Marguerite, I think this worked out for everyone." I didn't say anything. I set the phone face down on the counter, looked out at the snow still sitting heavy on the back fence, and thought, he has no idea what I've already done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began, because none of this makes sense without understanding who I was before that morning and who my nephew Trevor had always been to me. My name is Marguerite Okaforthable. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a family law paralegal in Sudbury, not a lawyer, but the woman who knew every document, every clause, every procedural trick that lawyers relied on and then forgot to credit. I retired 3 years ago when my left knee finally gave me an ultimatum. My husband Edouard passed from pancreatic cancer 6 years back, and what he left me was not a fortune, but it was enough. A paid-off house on Spruce Mill Road, a registered retirement savings account, a small rental property on the other side of town that brought in $1,400 a month, and a life insurance payout that I'd put into a GIC because I didn't trust myself to spend it wisely in the first year of grief. Edouard always said I was the most organized person he'd ever met. He said it like a compliment. After he died, I understood it was also a kind of armor. Trevor is my sister, Colette's son. Colette passed 11 years ago. From a stroke she was only 53, too young, too fast, and after that I became the closest thing Trevor had to a mother figure. He was 22 when Colette died, already restless, already the kind of young man who had big ideas and small follow-through. But he was charming. He had Colette's laugh and his father's confidence. And when he looked at you and said, "I've got this, Auntie," some part of you wanted to believe it even when the evidence said otherwise. I helped him through 2 failed business ventures in his 20s. A food truck that lasted 8 months, a landscaping company that dissolved when his business partner walked off with the equipment. I didn't give him money directly. I'd learned from watching other families what that does, but I co-signed a line of credit once, and I spent a weekend helping him draft a proper business plan that he then didn't follow. When he turned 32, he seemed to finally settle. He took a management job at a building supply company in Barrie. He met a woman named Petra. He called me every few weeks, remembered my birthday, showed up at Christmas with good wine and genuine warmth. I thought, there he is. There's the man Colette always believed he could be. I was 61 when I had the hip surgery. Not an emergency, but necessary. I'd been putting it off for 2 years, and my physiotherapist finally told me I was being stubborn to the point of damage. The recovery was going to be 6 to 8 weeks, and because I live alone and the house has stairs, my surgeon strongly recommended I have someone nearby during the first 2 weeks especially. Trevor offered immediately. Petra was doing a work placement in Vancouver that month. He had flexibility in his schedule, and he said, and I remember this clearly, "Auntie, you were there for me every time I fell apart. Let me be there for you." I was moved. I was grateful. I said yes. I want to be precise about what happened next, because precision matters, and because I know some of you are wondering how a retired paralegal, someone who spent 3 decades watching people get taken apart by paperwork, let this happen to her. The answer is that I was in pain, I was on medication, and I trusted him. And trust, when it's built on 30 years of love, is not stupidity. It is just love doing what love does. During my 2nd day post-surgery, still in the hospital, Trevor came to visit and brought a folder. He said my rental property manager had called. There was a maintenance issue, a potential liability concern with the roof, and the contractor needed authorization to begin assessment work right away, or the tenant could withhold rent. He said the property manager had emailed documents, but that someone needed to sign a simple authorization form. He held the folder toward me and said, "I can walk you through it. It's just 1 page." I was on hydromorphone. My reading glasses were in my bag across the room. I asked him what I was signing, and he explained clearly, calmly, with the right words, that it was a property management authorization form allowing temporary decisions to be made on the rental unit while I was recovering. That sounded reasonable. That sounded like exactly the kind of practical thing you sort out before surgery that I had apparently forgotten to sort out. I signed it. It was not a property management authorization form. I would not discover this for another 5 weeks. Trevor stayed for 11 days. He was, I have to say, genuinely helpful for most of it. He cooked, he drove me to follow-up appointments. He fixed the loose railing on the back steps that I'd been ignoring. He was present and kind, and on the 10th day he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said he had something difficult to share. He and Petra were planning to get married. This I knew they'd been together 4 years, and I'd assumed it was coming. What I didn't know was the scale of what they were envisioning. A destination wedding in Whistler, British Columbia, for 80 guests, with a reception at a lodge that Petra had apparently already toured and put a deposit on. The total estimated cost, Trevor told me, was just over $68,000. I asked him why he was telling me this in the specific way that he was telling me. He said that he and Petra had been saving but were about $30,000 short. He said that he knew I had the rental income and the GIC and that he wasn't asking for a gift, he was asking for a loan, and that he would pay it back within 3 years. He had a repayment plan typed out. He slid it across the table. I told him I needed to think about it. He nodded, said of course, and 2 days later he left for Barrie. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I went back and forth. On one side, he was family. He'd been good to me during recovery. The amount was significant but not ruinous, and a loan with a written repayment plan was a reasonable structure. On the other side, I'd been retired for 3 years. My income was fixed. The GIC was my emergency cushion, and I'd watched enough family law cases to know that informal family loans almost never get repaid on the agreed terms. I decided I would offer $15,000 as a gift, not a loan, a gift, because at least then expectations were clear, and I would tell him clearly that this was the ceiling. I called him on a Thursday evening and told him that. He thanked me. He said it was generous. He asked how I'd prefer to transfer the funds. I told him I'd set up an e-transfer from my personal account that weekend. I never got the chance. That Saturday morning I opened my online banking to set up the transfer. My personal checking account, where I kept approximately $23,000, a combination of my current spending funds and a buffer I maintained out of habit, showed a balance of $41. I sat very still. I refreshed the page. Yuan. I went to the transaction history. There were 2 withdrawals made 3 days earlier, on Wednesday, both at a branch in Barrie. One for $15,000, one for $7,800. Total, $22,800, gone in a single afternoon. I called my bank. I was on hold for 22 minutes. When I finally reached someone and explained what I was seeing, they told me the withdrawals had been made in person, at the teller window, by someone presenting a signed authorization document, a power of attorney document. I asked them to read me the name on that document. They said, Trevor Okafor Renaud. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Outside, Spruce Mill Road was quiet. A neighbor's dog was barking at something. The tea kettle I'd just boiled sat on the stove, getting cold. I am a retired paralegal. I have spent 31 years reading documents, and in that moment, sitting alone in my kitchen, 6 weeks after hip surgery, I understood with perfect clarity exactly what had happened, exactly what I had signed in that hospital room, and exactly what I needed to do next. I did not call Trevor. I called my former colleague Diane Marchetti, who is now a senior paralegal at a firm in Sudbury that handles estate and property law. I've known Diane for 26 years. I told her what had happened in 3 minutes flat. She said, "Don't touch anything. Don't call him. Come in Monday morning." Over the weekend, I made a list. I pulled every document I could access online for my accounts and properties. I logged into the provincial property records system I still remembered how from my working years and searched my rental property on Elm Terrace Road. There was a listing agreement on file, dated 6 weeks earlier, signed forged with my name. Trevor had listed my rental property for sale. The listing was with a real estate brokerage in Barrie. The asking price was $319,000. According to the record, there had already been 2 showings. I called Diane back that night. She answered on the 3rd ring, and when I told her about the listing, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Marguerite, this isn't just theft. This is fraud. We need to move on Monday, and we need to move fast." I said, "I know." I said, "I'll be there at 8. Then I made one more call. My tenant on Elm Terrace Road, a woman named Sylvie who'd rented from me for 7 years, had apparently been visited by a real estate agent for a routine showing notice. She'd called the number she had for me, which was my landline, and left a message I hadn't checked because I'd been focused on recovery and hadn't been using the landline much. I called her back that Saturday night. She was confused and a little alarmed. I told her that the listing was not authorized, that she was not going to be displaced, and that I was handling it through proper legal channels. She said, "I didn't think it seemed right. You never mentioned selling." I said, "I know. I'm sorry you were put in the middle of this. Now, I want to explain something about how the authorization document worked, because people always ask how this is possible. How can someone walk into a bank and withdraw tens of thousands of dollars from another person's account?" The answer is that what Trevor had me sign in the hospital was a broad, general power of attorney, not a limited property management form. A full POA that granted him authority over my financial and property decisions. It was drafted, and I later confirmed this through the notary record, by a notary in Barrie named Kevin Presse, who had prepared it 2 weeks before my surgery, which means Trevor planned this before he even offered to come help me recover. Let me sit with that for a moment, because I need you to understand. He planned this before he offered to help me. The kindness, the cooking, the fixed railing on the back steps, all of it was scaffolding around a document he needed me to sign while I was too medicated to read it carefully. On Monday, I sat across from Diane and her supervising lawyer, a man named Robert Fafard, who had the particular quiet competence of someone who has seen every variety of human bad behavior and is no longer surprised by any of it. He listened. He asked precise questions. He reviewed the POA document I'd requested a copy of from the bank. He said 3 things that I wrote down verbatim. First, the POA had procedural deficiencies. I had signed it without independent legal advice, which under Ontario's Substitute Decisions Act is not automatic grounds for invalidation, but creates a serious vulnerability, particularly given the circumstances under which it was signed post-surgery, on pain medication, without my reading glasses. Second, the real estate listing could be challenged immediately through the provincial land registry. Because the property was held in my name alone with a notation from Edward's estate settlement, any transfer would require additional documentation that Trevor could not fabricate without considerable effort and would create a clear paper trail. Third, what Trevor had done constituted criminal fraud and theft under the Criminal Code of Canada, sections 380 and 322 respectively, and I had standing to file a police report immediately. I filed the police report that afternoon, Financial Crimes Unit, Sudbury Detachment, because that's where I resided and where the original POA was executed. The officer who took my statement, a Constable Beaumont Walsh, mid-30s, very thorough, told me that they would be coordinating with Barrie Police, given Trevor's residence there. Robert Fafard sent a legal notice to the Barrie brokerage that same day, formally revoking any authorization related to my Elm Terrace property and putting them on notice of pending litigation if the listing was not withdrawn immediately. It was withdrawn within 48 hours. My bank, upon receiving formal documentation of the fraudulent POA from Diane's firm, froze the account pending investigation and opened an internal fraud file. They could not reverse the withdrawals immediately. That process takes time, but they flagged the transactions and cooperated fully. Now here is the part where I tell you about Trevor. He called me on a Wednesday, 9 days after that Saturday morning. He sounded entirely normal. He said he'd been thinking about my offer of $15,000 and wanted to know if I was still comfortable with that amount or whether I'd prefer to wait until the GIC matured. He said Petra had found a photographer she loved and deposits were coming due. I let him talk for a full minute. Then I said, "Trevor, the Elm Terrace listing has been withdrawn. The bank has frozen the account with a fraud flag. The police file number is SD 2024087731. Robert Fafard at Fafard & Associates is handling the civil side. I'd suggest you speak to a lawyer." There was silence. Then he said, "Auntie, I can explain." I said, "I'm going to stop you there. Anything you say to me right now, I am legally obligated to share with investigators. So for your own protection, stop talking and call a lawyer." I ended the call. I sat in my kitchen. Outside it had started to snow again. I thought about Colette. I thought about the way she used to call Trevor her little surprise because she hadn't expected to have children, and then there he was, this loud, laughing, endlessly hungry baby who she loved so completely it almost seemed like it hurt her. I thought about her face the last time I saw her, 2 days before the stroke, at a Sunday lunch at her house in Chelmsford, Trevor already 22, and she already so proud of the man she thought he was becoming. I didn't cry. I had already done that. Instead, I made a fresh cup of tea, drank it while it was still hot, and called Diane to report the conversation. The investigation moved in the way that legal matters move in Canada, which is to say carefully and not quickly. Over the following months, statements were taken, bank records were subpoenaed. The notary, Kevin Pressé, was interviewed, and what emerged was a picture that was both simpler and more calculated than I had initially assumed. Trevor had done his research. He had found a notary in a different city. He had prepared the documentation in advance. He had timed the entire plan around my surgery, understanding that the recovery period would give him a window of access and vulnerability. The Crown Attorney in Barrie approved charges fraud over $5,000 and theft over $5,000, approximately 5 months after I filed the initial report. Trevor was arrested on a Tuesday morning at the building supply company where he worked. His manager called Petra. Petra, to her credit, called me that afternoon. She was not part of it. She knew about the plan to ask me for money, but not about the POA, or the withdrawal, or the property listing. She was devastated in the way that you are when someone you love turns out to be someone you didn't know. She said, "I'm so sorry, Marguerite. I'm so sorry this happened." I said, "I know you are. I believe you." The wedding did not happen. I don't know what became of the lodge deposit in Whistler. At the civil level, Robert Fafard pursued recovery of the $22,800 through a civil judgment, which was granted. Whether Trevor will ever have the assets to satisfy that judgment is a separate question. At 64, I'm realistic about the practical limits of civil recovery. What mattered more to me was that the Elm Terrace property was protected, the fraudulent POA was formally revoked, and the criminal record that will now follow Trevor through employment background checks is a consequence that belongs entirely to the choices he made. The bank's internal fraud investigation ultimately resulted in a partial reimbursement, $8,400, related to their own procedural failure to apply sufficient verification on a large, in-person withdrawal from an account with no prior large withdrawal history. That process took 8 months and required Diane's firm to write 3 increasingly pointed letters. But it happened. I still live on Spruce Mill Road. My tenant Sylvie is still in the Elm Terrace unit, and last spring she put a small garden in along the fence line that I can see in the listing photos she sent me. I had my other knee looked at in September, and the surgeon says I'll need that one done eventually too. This time I have already drafted a limited, specific POA reviewed by Robert Fafard and a second independent lawyer that covers only medically necessary decisions for only the duration of a hospital stay, and assigns that authority to my friend Denise Chartrand, who is a retired nurse and someone I trust with my life, which is literally what a POA means. I do not hate my nephew. I have sat with this enough to know that hatred is not what I feel. What I feel is something harder to name, a grief that has no timeline, for the person I thought he was, for the family I thought we were, for my sister Colette, who did not live to see this, and who I am grateful every day did not have to. I loved Trevor for 30 years. That love did not make me a fool. It made me human. The difference between being human and being a victim is whether you let the love be used against you twice. He used it against me once. I made sure there would not be a second time. There are things I want you to take from this, especially if you are a woman of a certain age, living alone, with assets you have spent a lifetime building. A power of attorney is one of the most powerful legal documents that exists. It is also one of the most commonly abused. Before you sign anything with those words on it, you should have it reviewed by a lawyer who is acting solely for you, not for the person handing you the document, not for the notary they chose, not for the bank that seems to want everything signed quickly. Your lawyer, your eyes, your understanding. If you are recovering from surgery, do not sign financial documents at the hospital. There is nothing, no maintenance issue, no contractor deadline, no urgent authorization that cannot wait until you are home and clear-headed and wearing your reading glasses. If someone tells you otherwise, that urgency is itself a warning sign. Know your accounts. Know your properties. Set up transaction alerts with your bank so that any withdrawal over a threshold you choose. Mine is now $500 sends you an immediate text message. This costs nothing and takes 10 minutes to arrange. Consider how your property is held. Edouard and I had discussed putting the rental property into a family trust years ago and had never gotten around to it. If we had, the fraudulent listing would have been impossible without trustee documentation that Trevor could not have accessed. It is worth a conversation with an estate lawyer, especially if you are a widow or widower managing property alone. And finally, write it down, all of it. Your assets, your accounts, your property records, your legal documents. Keep a copy in a safety deposit box and leave one with a trusted friend or your lawyer. Not because you expect the worst, but because the people who love you should be able to help you quickly if something goes wrong. And the people who wish you harm should find that every door they try is already locked. I am 64 years old. I am not fragile. I built my life carefully, and I protected it the same way. If Trevor was betting that I would be too tired, too medicated, too grief-softened to fight back, he forgot one thing. I spent 31 years watching how these cases go. I already knew how this one would end before he made his first move.